We started by showing how reincarnation is a legitimate and ancient Jewish belief. It goes back all the way to the Tanakh. There are many scriptural sources for it, specifically a verse in the book of Job, right? Eov, also in many other places, in Amos, even in the Chumash, various sources that speak about reincarnation. Also the prophetess Abigail, who told King David about something called Kaf Hakela, the great cosmic sling, which the Arizal and the Zohar both explain. What does that mean when Abigail said that the souls of your enemies, the souls of the wicked ones, will be flung back and forth in a cosmic sling, in a Kaf Hakela? So the Zohar and the Arizal say this is reincarnation. Kaf Hakela means like a slingshot, like a soul is being slung from one body to another. So those were the various scriptural sources that we saw for reincarnation. We saw the Arizal, who says that there's 5 main reasons why a person would reincarnate, or 3 main reasons and 2 others. So the first reason was to rectify a past transgression, to somehow atone for a sin in a past life. That was reason number 1. Number 2 was to fulfill a mitzvah, a positive mitzvah that a person failed to fulfill in a past life. Number 3 was maybe to help somebody else. Number 3 is not that the person did something wrong or didn't do something, but maybe they did something right, and their soul is particularly good at doing some particular job, and so that soul is needed to come back to the world to help other people. That was reason number 3. And then another reason was to marry your soulmate. So although everybody has their designated soulmate, because of free will, people don't necessarily marry their soulmate. They might make the wrong choices, or because of free will, they might never meet their soulmate. And so, therefore, you might have to come back and reincarnate to actually marry your soulmate. That was reason number 4. And reason number 5 is you might come back to help your soulmate with their issues, or maybe, your marriage didn't work so well and you need to come back and try again. So again, the last 2 reasons have to do with marriage and soulmates. So those are the 5 big reasons. And we said how generally there's 3 reincarnations based on Job and the Chumash and various sources that a person can get. Assuming that they improve, they can keep reincarnating. Notzel chesed la'alafim, that's the meaning of that term, that God extends his kindness to thousands of generations. That means that if assuming that a soul is improving, they can keep reincarnating even 1,000 times, but if they're getting worse, then they get 3 chances, right? So that's what it means when God says he will pass on the sins, al shilashim ve'al ribeim, to the 3rd and 4th generation, meaning that if a person's getting worse with each reincarnation, then they get 3 chances, which means 4 lives. And after that point, if the person has not rectified and not done what they need to do, then they would go to Gehenom, which typically is described as having a maximum sentence of 12 months. And then the part that we focused a lot on is that the whole concept of Gehenom and even Gan Eden and Olam Haba, it's really all here. It's not like people generally think that there's some other place, some unknown dimension elsewhere. Like these descriptions of like fire and brimstone and torture somewhere else, but it's actually Gehenom is here, and the word Gehenom itself is a place outside of Jerusalem, as we said. Not that particular place is hell, but that the idea behind it is to teach us that heaven and hell is really over here, and people suffer their punishment here, and that also helps to explain why there's so much seemingly inexplicable suffering in the world. Innocent people suffering, children suffering, doesn't make sense. Why are they suffering? The only real way to explain it is that they deserve it because of a past life, not because of something they did in this life, because they are, children or whatever, or righteous people like Job, which we're going to get to. Why did Job suffer? He was so righteous. Why did he deserve that suffering? So the only way to really explain that inexplicable suffering is it must be because of a past life. That's what we described before. And so a person could very much experience hell on earth.
Doesn't Arizal say that there is actually a Gehenom aside from coming here?
Yes.
He does say it specifically.
Right. A 12-month Gehenom, yes. But this is something that we also have to do over the course of this class and in the future, is talk about how do we understand the Arizal. So I'll say this now and I'll come back to it, that we don't actually have any of the Arizal's direct works. Right. Everything that we have from the Arizal is really coming from his students. mainly Rav Chaim Vital, but he's not the only one. And like we said before, and I'll quote again today, there's the Rama Mifano, and there's Yosef ben Tabul, who's not so well known. And there was a little bit of a power struggle after the Arizal passed away between those two people, between Rav Chaim Vital and Ibn Tabul, who is the main disciple of the Arizal and who has the right to disseminate his teachings. And not all of the teachings of the Arizal actually correspond neatly to each other and fit together. So there's a lot of contradictions. Even in the Kitvei HaArizal of Rav Chaim Vital, he contradicts himself sometimes. And he says, I heard one thing, but maybe it was this way. It might be like this, it might be like that. So the Arizal is not straightforward. You can't just read it like a novel and say, I get it now. You have to read various sources and try to integrate them. The Arizal itself is like a puzzle. And to get the complete picture also, you can't just read the Kitvei HaArizal of Rav Chaim Vital, although that's generally what's become like the accepted tradition, that if you want to know the Arizal, you study Rav Chaim Vital. But there are other sources. So like the Rama Mifano might contradict with what Rav Chaim Vital says. So you have to put it all together to get the complete picture, because the Arizal is very much a puzzle. So we're going to see some examples of that as we go through it. Yeah, it's not so straightforward to try to grasp what exactly did the Arizal mean. Also, Rav Chaim Vital often says that I'm not sure what he meant. It may have been like this or like that. I think I heard this. And then also his son, Rav Shmuel Vital, sometimes adds a comment and says, well, he adds his 2 cents. And one thing that people don't know is that even after them, there were other rabbis who edited these books quite significantly, including Rav Meir Poppers. And that you don't know. What did he change? What did he add? What did he remove? It's not clear. There were later editors to these texts. And sometimes you read something that seems out of place. I've seen various such pieces. I'm not going to talk about it now. But I think we'll devote a separate series to the Arizal. Because sometimes you read the Arizal and you see something inconsistent. You're like, where did that come from? That doesn't seem like the Arizal would have said something like this. So just because something is in Kitvei HaArizal is not necessarily definitively also his teaching. So the Arizal itself is a puzzle that we have to make sense of. So we'll talk more about that in the future, I think. We spoke about how heaven and hell is here. Olam Haba is also here. Interestingly, the Gemara, one beautiful Gemara that just to emphasize this point, because it's something that we're transitioning into that world now. In Masechet Ketubot, it says, Lo ka'olam hazeh ha'olam haba. That olam haba, like this future era of reward, is not like this world. Ha'olam hazeh yesh bo tza'ar. Like in this world, we have pain and suffering and things like that. Even in basics, when you work, you suffer. Liftzor and lidroch. Like when you make wine, it takes a lot of work to trample and whatever it is, to press the wine and all that. Ha'olam haba, but in the future world, what's going to happen? Nevia nava achat, you can just take one grape or one cluster of grapes, bakaron or basfina, and you put it in some kind of, I don't know, sfina, boat, but it doesn't really mean literally a boat, in some kind of machine. I think the idea here is like maybe something with a spinning wheel or something, whatever, some kind of mechanism, umanicha bezavit beito, and you put it just in the corner of your house, umesapek imeno kefitos gadol, and you get out of it tons and tons of wine, lots of jugs of wine. So basically what it's saying is, and it continues to describe it, and it gives a proof verse from Parashat Ha'azinu, V'dam einav tishteh chamer, and it explains why that is. That chamer means al tikre chamer ela chomer, that you're gonna, in olam haba, there are gonna be devices that actually make a lot of stuff from a very minimal amount of material. Like you put in one grape. If you read this Gemara literally, it's 2,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago when it would have been written, it would have sounded impossible. You put in one grape and it gives you endless jugs of wine. Back then, it would have been impossible. But today, that's actually quite possible. We do that all the time. Today, you can take literally one cell from an animal, and you have lab-grown meat. There are Israeli, if you've ever seen Israel's, there's a company in Israel called Stakeholder, beautiful, a huge machine. And the machine prints for you whatever you want. Meats, beef steak, chicken, fish, salmon. Yeah, it's amazing. That's the future. That's the future, right? So today, we actually have this.
My son tasted it.
Yeah? No, it's not. It's Supposed to be pretty. There's a video of Bibi Netanyahu trying it. He had a fish, yeah. So you have a machine, much like this says. You'll have one little boat-like machine in the corner of your house, and you put in a sample of what you want, and it's going to miraculously multiply perfectly healthy and fine-tuned with all the nutrients and macromolecules that you need. We're already living this. We're transitioning into that phase. So I only bring this up because people want to just hold on to this, have a very hard time giving up this idea that Olam Haba is somewhere else, in some ethereal realm with halos and angels and clouds. Like, that is not a Jewish view of the afterlife. Olam Haba is here. It's not Olam Ha'u, it's Olam Haba. There's Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. It's the world to come. It's a world that's coming here. And we brought many examples last time of how both heaven and hell are described in very earthly, physical terms. And here the Gemara itself also says, in Olam Haba, you're going to be able, there's still physical stuff, there's still food and there's still whatever, but there's no tsa'ar, there's no suffering, and you don't have to work hard. And you're going to have machines that are going to make for you wine. And we already have that. Today, winemakers, you only need a few guys and you can run an entire winery. Most of it is done automatically. Exactly. If you ever go to do a winery tour today, there's nobody there. It's like the tour guide, and everything else is done automatically. So we're already living, we're clearly transitioning into Olam Haba. Back to reincarnation. Okay, so now we want to actually get into the meat of reincarnation. Look at actual, no pun intended, look at actual examples. So last time we actually finished with one example of Naval and Balaam and Hevel. We looked at Hevel, Cain and Abel. That Cain killed Abel. Abel had a good part of him, the hay, and the bad part, the Bet Lamed. And we said that the Beit Lamed went into Lavan, and then Balaam, and then Naval, and that was his 3 strikes, and you're out. And then the Tanakh actually says that Naval became, his heart became a stone, Uayala Avin, that he became a stone. And the Arizal says that's an allusion to the fact that he literally was reincarnated in a stone. So there is, by the way, again, with what we were saying before about understanding the Arizal, there's 2 ways to understand what the Arizal said about Naval. There's one way to read it, that he first was in a stone as Balaam, that Balaam's reincarnation, his punishment was to be in a stone, and then from a stone he was rectified enough to come back in human form and was given another opportunity as Naval, and that's why it says U Hayale Avin, that he was a stone, that Naval had been a stone in a past life. So between Balaam and Naval, there was a stone. The another way to read it is the 3 strikes and you're out thing, which is that he went Lavan, Balaam, Naval, then he became a stone. I think you can read it both ways. That's a challenge that we want to focus on next class, which I want to do next week. And I want to do it on the issue of time. I mean, we say that time doesn't really matter in the Torah. There is no before and after in the Torah. I want to talk about time, the time issue. But again, the whole thing with understanding the Arizal is sometimes there are multiple approaches. So was it 1, 2, 3 stone, or was it 1, 2 stone and then Naval? There's 2 ways to look at it. But regardless, the same idea, that it illustrates the point. That the Beit Lamed from Hevel went into Balaam and Lavan and Naval, and that's why they all have the Beit Lamed in them, and then ultimately ended up in a stone, or at some point had a phase in a stone. And then we want to focus on what happened to Cain also. So just to finish off with Hevel, first the Arizal says in this passage that Ein ruach mitgalgel ad asher titgalgel nefesh. So to understand all this, we have to quickly recap that there are 5 parts to the soul, right? There are 5 general levels to the soul. The lowest level is called nefesh. Nefesh is associated with the bloodstream, typically. Then you have ruach, which is associated with the vital organs, particularly the heart. And then you have neshama, which is associated with the brain. They go higher and higher. And then you have 2 more, which are even more lofty, and most people never really access them, which is the chaya, which is associated with one's aura, something that really exudes out of their body, and the yechida, which is like a divine umbilical cord connecting you to the heavens or to God or whatever, to this upper, higher spiritual realms. So 5 levels to the soul. At the bottom, nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, yechida. And the Arizal says, Ein ruach mitgalgel, at asher titgalgel nefesh, Vetushlam. So first you have to rectify your nefesh, then you can rectify your ruach, and then you can rectify your neshama, and so on. Ve'ine evel hayu bo nefesh veruach mekulkalim u'me'orvim ra betov, aval haneshama hayta tova legamre. So the Arizal says that Hevel had an impure nefesh and ruach, but his neshama was pure. The Beit Lamed of his name, Hevel, is Hey Bet Lamed. Abel, Hevel, Hey Bet Lamed. The Hey was the holy part of him, the good part, the neshama that was pure. The Beit Lamed was the part of his soul that wasn't impure, the nefesh and ruach. And each part reincarnated in different people. Ki atov sheba hiya Hey shel Evel, that's what we just said. The good part was the Hey. And that part was given, v'zu nitna leshet. That part actually first went, because Abel was killed, so then the Hey of his name went to Shet, to Seth, which was the next child of Adam and Eve. After Cain killed Abel, remember the Torah says that when Adam was 130, he had another child, and that was Shet. So the good part of Hevel first went to Shet, and the Arizal says, Zes Sod, this is the secret of a pasuk in Psalms, and the verse in Psalm says, Shata tachat raglav. The word shata is an allusion to Shet Hey, that Shet, Seth, received the Hey from Hevel. Okay, Otiyot Shata Hem Shet Hey. Okay, so Shet received, that's an allusion, this verse in Psalms is an allusion to Seth receiving the Hey. And then where did that Hey go? It actually went to Moshe. So Moses got the Hey of Moshe, Mem Shin Hey, came from Abel. So the soul of Abel, the good part of his soul, went into Seth first, and then from Seth to Moshe. And that's the secret of this verse. The whole verse in Psalms, it's in chapter 8, is Ma enosh ki tizkarenu ven adam ki tifkadenu. What is man that you should remember him? What are mortals that God should even care about us? And it goes on to say, Vatachasreu me'at me Elohim, that you made man a little bit less than Elohim, a little bit less than the angels, a little bit less than the divine. We were made Betzelem Elohim. We were made in the image of the divine. And tamshilehu b'maaseh yadecha kol shata tachat raglav. You laid the world under his feet. That's the whole verse. And the Arizal says the secret of this verse is to tell you that it's the reincarnation of Abel, because who was the one that was the closest to being like Elohim? Who is described in the Torah as being Isha Elohim? In Tanakh. Moshe is described in Tanakh as being the man of God, Isha Elohim. So the Arizal says this whole verse is alluding to Kvar yadata mizmor ze ne'emar al Moshe. This verse is talking about Moses. She'alav ne'emar, that he was me'at me Elohim. He was this divine man. Ve'ine u Shet atzmo kmo she'idber. So he was the reincarnation of Seth, who was the reincarnation of Abel. So the secret of that verse in Psalms, in chapter 8, next time you read that verse, if you actually break it down, it's talking about that part of Abel that went into Moses, that went into Seth, Shet, that's why it says Shata Tachat Raglav, and that went into Moses, that's why it says Me'at Me Elohim, which was Moses. Make sense?
What were you saying about the order in which you have to rectify? You have to start from the bottom and work up.
Yeah.
So how did he have...
That was the Hey, that was the good part. That part went to do its job in Seth and in Moses. The part that needed rectification is the Bet Lamed. So then the Bet Lamed came back in Lavan and the Balaam and Naval. And he gives, the Arizal explains all that. We already covered it, so I want to move on. And that's another verse in Psalms 147. You know this verse, it's in our prayers. Umishpatim bal yedeum. Where we say that verse, Hallelujah, Mishpatim bal yedeum. That's an allusion to this Bet Lamed. Mishpatim bal yedeum. They didn't know God's laws. Who is that talking about? Lavan, Balaam, and Naval, who didn't fulfill God's laws, and they had that Bet Lamed. That's the secret of this verse, Mishpatim bal yedeum. That they don't know the laws of God. They did not fulfill God's law. So that's the Bet Lamed. So you have two verses that allude secretly on the Sod level to the reincarnations of Abel. And Balaam, of course, was as our sages described, the anti-Moses. That Balaam was as great as Moses. Moses was the greatest prophet among the Jews, and Balaam was the greatest prophet ever among the Gentiles, and God did that on purpose so that the two kind of balance each other out, and that so that the nations also wouldn't say that, how come we never had a Moses? You did, you had a Balaam. Like, they were counter forces to each other. So it's interesting that Moses and Balaam came from the same actual spiritual root. They both came from Abel. Moses had the hay from Abel, and Balaam had the bet lamed from Abel. So it's two people that actually were reincarnations of one person, and they both had this incredible spiritual power. The two greatest prophets in history, the Jewish one and the non-Jewish one, Moshe and Balaam.
So does Moshe and Seth get fresh ruach and nefesh?
Yeah, they would have other pieces of their own, yeah. We're going to see more of that. You have multiple pieces. Every person has multiple sparks and pieces
so
in their
first
boat.
time through, the 5 levels are from the same soul, and then those...
Yeah, you can have
subsequent
pieces.
Reincarnations all mixed
Exactly.
back.
Yes, exactly. That was the candle analogy that we used last time also, that you can light multiple candles, multiple flames from one flame. Right? Okay, now, that was Abel's whole story. What about Cain? Cain's is even more fascinating. What happened to Cain? So Cain killed Abel. So first question, why did Cain kill Abel? What led to that fight? Jealousy over what?
Sacrifice.
The sacrifice. So the pshat seems to be, when you read the Torah, Cain brought an offering. Then Abel said, hey, that's a great idea. I'm also going to bring an offering. And Abel's was better. And God took Abel's but not Cain's. And Cain was upset. It seems to be, although these are two separate things. They're not directly connected. But it seems to be that after that, Cain killed Abel. So was it over that particular offering? Not clear, but we do have a tradition, the Midrash says, and it's in many different places, that actually they weren't fighting over the offering. They were fighting over, of course, what do guys always fight over? They were fighting over a girl. Yeah. So what was the girl? Who was the girl?
The twin.
Right, there was a twin. Who did they marry? Cain and Abel. There was nobody else around. There was Adam and Eve. And then Cain actually was born with a twin sister, who would be his wife. And there was no prohibition of incest yet, and because, you couldn't. That would be the only way to reproduce. So Cain had a twin sister that he was born with, who was destined to be his wife. And Abel was born with two twin sisters. They were triplets. So he had two wives.
Actually, where do we know this stuff from?
This is an oral tradition.
Yeah, how do you know that?
So let's see.
No, it's not possible there were other people that are not considered.
There were. I believe there were, yes. I believe there were.
Evidence shows there was, right?
Yes.
So they're not considered Adam, but
Right.
they're mingled.
Yes, there are sources that say, and the Zohar even suggests this, that Cain went elsewhere when he was banished from their village, whatever, that he went elsewhere and married other people that were around that didn't have a divine neshama, but there actually were people outside of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were unique in that they had a neshama, nishmat chaim, right? That God breathed into them a neshama. But there were people without a neshama, less civilized, outside of the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden was, Adam and Eve were the first civilized humans. Because remember, in chapter 1, God already made people. And then in chapter 2, he seemingly makes people again. This time, he says, I'm giving them a neshama, which implies that in chapter 1, God made people on the day 6 with all the animals in general. There were animal-like people, uncivilized people. And then in chapter 2, God actually made specific Adam and Eve and breathed a neshama into them in the Garden of Eden. So that another way to read this is to say, no, Adam and Eve were unique in that they were divine and had a neshama and were civilized and were farmers. God literally told them in the Torah explicit to work the garden. Le'ovda ve'leshomra. You have to tend the garden. They were the first farmers. Farming is like the birth of civilization. You no longer have to be nomadic and animalistic. You can grow lots of food. And then once you grow lots of food, not everybody has to worry about making food. You grow the food because you can make plenty. I'll do other things. And then you can have differentiation of labor, right? Once you have that technology of farming, then you no longer have to be like an animal, nomadic, moving around, hunting. You can actually settle down. You can start building cities and so on. You can have people, not everybody has to be a farmer now because one person can grow enough food for many people. So really the mark of civilization is farming, and that's exactly what the Torah is saying, that Adam and Eve were like the first farmers. God put them in a garden and told them, tend the garden and enjoy all of this produce. And now you have a permanent settlement, the Garden of Eden. Man doesn't have to be nomadic. So the people in chapter 1 would have been soulless. Like they had a nefesh, like an animalistic soul, but no neshama. And they were nomadic, and they were more like animals. And then Adam and Eve were the divine ones that that had this farming technology, the first civilized people that had a permanent settlement. And Cain, when he was banished from their community, would have gone, and the Zohar suggests this in one place, and married other people who were uncivilized.
So what happened to all the uncivilized people?
Well, the flood would have taken care of them. The flood would have, but after the flood, nobody was left except Noah, who came from Shet, so there doesn't matter already. Yeah, you were going to add something to that? Yeah, same thing? Okay. Yeah.
Like it's cavemen, that's
Right, there were cave people, and we do find, archaeologists find various cave paintings, Lascaux and this and that, and who made those things, right? Like pre-civilized human remains we do find, so that could be it. In any case, that's a different view, and one view, the Midrashic view, is they could both be true. It could be this and that Cain was born with a twin, and also married other people outside of the Garden of Eden. It could be that they're both true, probably. So Cain, according to this version of events, Cain was born with a twin, Abel was born with two twins, so now who gets the extra girl? Abel is saying, well, she was born with me, so it must be that God wants me to marry her. And Cain says, yeah, but I'm the older one. The firstborn gets double. Generally, the firstborn has the honor of getting a double portion of everything. So I should get. So anyway, so they fight over the girl. And the Zohar also says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Yeah.
You end up with the two of them. And plus the one that
Right, so let's look. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Mai Dichtiv. So the Zohar is saying, why does it say Vehi beyotam basadeh? The Torah says that they were in the field and they fought and Cain killed Abel. The Torah's language is Vehi beyotam basadeh, and it was when they were in the field. Mai basadeh. What does it mean basadeh? What is a sadeh an allusion to in more metaphorical language? Da itata, it's a woman. A field is it's like a metaphor, a euphemism or whatever, another word for a woman. Ve'alda kamuktile. And it was actually what the Torah means, the deeper meaning of that they were in the field. Why does the Torah even mention they were in the field? Who cares? They were in the field, they were at home. What does it matter? They were in the forest, they were on the moon. Who cares? Like Cain killed Abel. The Torah could have just said Cain arose and killed Abel. That's all it had to say. Why does it say basadeh? And so the Zohar says here, and it's really quoting older sources, sadeh is a euphemism for a woman. A woman is the field for the man. So they fought over the woman. Ve'kane Cain lehevel al nukve, and Cain was jealous of Abel over the wife. And Rabbi Chia amar hachazinan dichti veichar leKain meod veiplu panav al delo itkabil korbane. And also another opinion. Also, it was over the sacrifice. Also, it's true that Cain was already upset by the whole offering thing, that his offering wasn't taken. So he was already in a bad mood. Plus, there was the girl issue. Altogether, it turned out to be that Cain killed Abel. Okay, that's how it starts. So what happened? So what does Cain have to rectify? Cain has a few issues here. Number one is he brought a faulty offering. That's the first thing. Number two is he killed his brother. He killed somebody. That needs rectification. And number three is he stole a girl. He took a girl that wasn't destined for him. So he has to rectify those three things, the Arizal says. And the Arizal is a puzzle. So I'm piecing together from a few different sources. So I'm not going to read any one particular source. It's in Shara Gilgulim, chapter 36. It's in Shara Mitzvot on Shoftim. So I'm just going to piece it all together for you. Because, again, the Arizal is a puzzle. And to get the complete picture, you can't just read one passage. You really have to read the whole thing and put it all together. So what the Arizal says is something really beautiful. He says, what happened to, again, we have to trace the letters. With Abel, we trace the Hey Bet Lamed. So what about Cain? Cain is Kuf Yud Nun. What happened to the Kuf? The Kuf went to Korach. Who was Korach? Korach was an adversary of Moses. Korach was Moses' cousin and said, he accused Moses and Aaron of nepotism. You guys are putting your own family members, you made yourself the king, Moses. You made your brother the high priest. You made your other guy, whatever, the head of the Levites. And I'm also a Levite. I should have. So he was accusing them of nepotism and saying that they want to take all the power to themselves. And he was saying, everybody's holy, we should all be able to bring offerings. So Korach challenged Moses. Really, what he was supposed to do is rectify the sin of Cain to bring a wholesome offering. And what happened? He failed again because he brought an offering. The Torah says he brought another offering that God rejected. So he made the same mistake he made in a past life. And the other thing is, what was the result of that? Moshe made a miracle, asked Hashem to take care of business, and Moshe made the earth open up, and Korach was swallowed by the earth. The Arizal says that's midah keneged midah. It's measure for measure, because what did Cain do to Abel? He killed him, and he buried him, hid him in the earth. And then God said, oh, the blood of your brother is calling out from the earth. So midah keneged midah, measure for measure. In their next reincarnation, Moses, who was Abel, Moses was the hay of Abel. Moses had Korach buried in the earth. Right? So measure for measure. So the hay of Abel and the kuf of Cain went into Moses and Korach. So Korach failed that rectification and would have to come back again. We'll leave that aside for now. What about the Yud of Cain? The Yud went into Yitro. That's right. Yitro was the father-in-law of Moses. Yitro was Moses' father-in-law. He actually did fulfill the rectification. Good. What did Yitro do? Yitro gave his daughter Tzipporah for Moses to be a wife. So Yitro fulfilled the sin of the past life, which is stealing the girl. So in the next life, he gave his own daughter to Moses as a way of rectifying that sin. So the Yud of Cain went to Yitro, and that rectified the whole thing with the girl. And finally, the Nun went into somebody whose name we're actually unsure of. It could have just been Nun, actually. But the last person that had an important interaction with Moshe was the Mitzri, the Egyptian that Moses killed. Remember, Moses ran away from Egypt because he killed an Egyptian. So that rectified the Cain killed Abel and hid him in the ground. And then Moshe killed the Egyptian and hid him in the ground. That was, again, a measure for measure replay of past events. So that Egyptian, the Mitzri, was a reincarnation of the Nun of Cain, went into the Mitzri. And it's possible that his name actually was Nun, because Nun is an Egyptian word. And in ancient Egyptian mythology, Nun was actually their word for the primordial substance of creation. The ancient Egyptians had a pantheon of gods, but they believed that the origin of it all is something called Nun, like the initial primordial substance. So Nun is an important word in Egyptian mythology, and perhaps even a name. It's kind of like the Hindu Brahman, that like the original source of all the pantheon of gods in ancient Egypt, that was called Nun. So it's possible that Egyptian actually had a name that had a Nun in it or whatever. We don't know what his name was. But again, that was a measure for measure that Moses had to kill that Egyptian because Cain killed Abel.
Is it also fish?
Nun means in Aramaic fish, also. A fish, yeah. Right, exactly.
When you say rectifying, I think, in my mind, I envision you doing something right, and then you rectify it.
Right.
Here, in these examples, it looks like the Egyptian, who still wasn't a good person, somehow rectified his soul just by being punished.
Right. Sometimes that's all it is.
That's a form of
Yeah,
rectification.
because remember, the Arizal says that you come back in your reincarnation, you often suffer to rectify. So that was his suffering. He was killed by Moses, and that fulfilled the suffering he caused to Abel.
Wow, so really bad people can actually create a perfect
Sure,
soul.
absolutely. Yeah. That's all suffering is meant to.
Yeah.
All death and suffering is some kind of tikkun, right?
If you don't remember these past lives, then how?
You have to not remember. So we said that before. Because if you do remember, then it defeats the purpose. Because if you do remember, then it's like you're coming into this world and you're like, oh, in a past life I killed Cain. Somebody is going to kill me any day now, right? So I'm a walking dead man. You can't remember. If you do remember, it defeats the whole purpose, right? So the whole thing is it has to be mysterious. And the suffering, it's only real suffering when you don't know why you're suffering. Yeah. If you know why you're suffering, then it's like, okay, I'm getting what I deserve. I made other people suffer. Now I'm suffering, right?
If somebody feels like, somebody who, let's say, not doing good things, they feel like, oh, well, I have a good life. Who cares what my next life is going to look like? Because this world I'm doing good, you know? So then... And
they will suffer in their next life. So.
And they're good.
Yeah, we have to think more cosmically, right? We're so used to thinking in confined terms of like one individual lifespan, but we have to expand our understanding of life. You're just in this particular video game right now, right? But you're going to come back And I mean that quite literally. I want to talk about that too, maybe in 2 weeks. That was Cain's reincarnation. In Korach, in Yethro, and in the Mitzri, in the Egyptian. And again, the Arizal brings us a proof for this, because these are all psukim in Tanakh that allude on a sod level, on a secret level, to these things. So what is the verse that alludes to the reincarnations of Cain? We saw the verses that allude to the reincarnations of Abel. What's the verse that alludes to Cain? There's a pasuk in Genesis, in Bereshit, that says, Ki shivatayim yukam Cain, that Cain will be avenged sevenfold. Shivatayim yukam Cain. The Arizal says, what is yukam? Roshei tevot. It's an acronym. When did Cain get all of his whatever, what he deserved? In the future lives of yukam. Yud, kuf, mem, Yitro, Korach, Mitzri. In those 3 souls. So you have a proof text for that on a sod level. Okay, excellent. That's Cain and Abel. Next, we promised to go back to Job, to Eov. Why did Eov suffer? That's how we started our discussion. We started in part 1 with the verse in Eov that actually tells us about reincarnation. Job was complaining to his friends that I'm righteous, I've lived a righteous life, and yet I've suffered this horrible, horrible suffering, and God is not just, and his friends tried to calm him down, and then Elihu told him the secret of reincarnation, saying, no, you're suffering for your past lives. It's not because of anything you did in this life, it's for something you did in a past life. So who was he in a past life? Who was Eov in a past life? The Arizal explains in Shara Psukim. Nodahu inyan Terach avi Avraham, shenitgalgel be'Eov. That Terach, the father of Abraham, Abraham's father, Terach, reincarnated in Job. ועל ידי ייסורים שעברו עליו, חזר בתשובה שלמה. And Terach ultimately did tshuva. Our sages say that he died righteous. ורמז רמז לו זה באומרו ואתה תבוא אל אבותיך בשלום, כמה שאמרו חז"ל. So our sages said that Terach, the father of Abraham, originally was an idolater. And he was the one that actually gave up his own son to be imprisoned. You know this story? Abraham was born in a house of idolatry. His father even sold idols. His father was an idol maker and seller. That was his business. And you remember the story that Abraham, even as a child, took a hammer and crushed all the idols and caused so much trouble to his father that ultimately his father actually had his son arrested and thrown in jail. And the Talmud says, and we'll get to it, that Abraham spent 10 years in jail. His own father gave him up, and Abraham spent 10 years in jail. And we'll see why. The Gemara says in Bava Batra, Amar Rav Hanan bar Rava Amar Rav, 10 shanim nichbash Avraham Avinu. So Abraham was imprisoned for 10 years. Shalosh bekuta v'sheva bekardu. So 3 years he was imprisoned in a place called Kuta, and 7 years in Kurdistan, Bekardu. We're going to see why that's actually significant. He spent 10 years in jail, and the Gemara specifically tells us 3 years in one jail, 7 years in another jail. Who cares what jail he was in? Why does it matter? He spent 10 years in jail. So we're going to see the significance of that, of 3 and 7. But his own father threw him and had him put in jail, but ultimately he repented. And at the end of his life, Terach became righteous, and that's why the verse says in the Torah that God told Abraham, God told Abraham that you will come back to your fathers in peace, which implies that his fathers were good, that you will join your fathers. When you are buried, you will join them peacefully, which implies that his father was a good person, and he will join him, right? That's the idea. So we know that Terach repented, but he had to make up for his original sins of being an idolater, of actually being a moser, that he put his own son, had his own son put in jail. So he came back in Eov. And who was Eov? Eov had to rectify that. He was Terach. But Eov also had another thing in a past life. Who was he in a past life? Kmo she'amru Chazal, like the sages again say in the Talmud and in other places, that Eov in a past life, aya echad migimel yoatzei paro. He was one of Pharaoh's 3 advisors. Who were Pharaoh's 3 advisors? Anybody remember this story?
Yeah. One was Yethro.
Yethro was one of them. Yethro was actually originally an advisor to the Pharaoh. And then the other was Balaam. Balaam was originally an advisor to Pharaoh. And Job, not Job himself. According to the Arizal, it wasn't Job himself, but Job in a past life was an advisor to Pharaoh. Pharaoh's 3 trusted advisors. And when Pharaoh wanted to solve the Jewish problem, Balaam said, execute them, whatever, throw the children in the river. Yitro protested, and because he said no, he actually fled Egypt and ended up in Midian. That's how he ended up in Midian. And interestingly enough, there's a beautiful midrash that's Yitro played a critical role here because he took the staff of Joseph. He took the special divine staff of Joseph that was housed in the Egyptian palace. Since Joseph had passed away, he had that special staff. That's a staff that the Mishnah says God made at the beginning of creation. He gave that staff to Adam. Adam had this divine special staff. It passed down all the way to Noach. Noach passed it on ultimately to Abraham. Abraham met Noach. Abraham and Noah met each other very briefly. And there's a very easy way to remember it because Noach, the gematria of Noach is 58, Nun Chet. And that's an allusion to Abraham was 58 years old when he met Noach. And you know that if you add up the years, because we know Abraham was born in the Jewish year 1948, in the Hebrew year, and we know that Noach died in the Hebrew year 2006. So Abraham met Noach right before Noach passed away, when he was 58 years old, and Noach passed on the divine staff to him. Abraham passed it on to Isaac, to Jacob, Jacob to Yosef. Yosef had it with him, and then in the palace, it remained in the palace when he died. And Yitro then, when he ran away from Egypt, he left the palace, he grabbed the staff, took it with him to Midian, and there's a beautiful midrash that says when he got to his home in Midian, he put it in the ground, and then he didn't even realize, but when he put it in the ground, it immediately gave roots and got stuck in the ground, and he couldn't move it. So then after that, anytime a person would come and want one of his daughters as a wife or whatever, Yitro would say, okay, if you can pull that staff out of the ground, you can get the wife. And nobody could pull it out because it was like rooted into the soil until Moshe came and very casually lifted it out of the ground because it really belonged to him. And that's how Yitro knew that he had to give him Tzipporah and he was the one and so on. So it's kind of like Excalibur. And really, some say the Excalibur myth is based on this midrash, because the midrash is for sure older. This midrash goes back at least 1,500 years. The midrash of Moses pulling the staff, the unpullable staff, out of the ground. And the story of Excalibur is less than 1,000 years old. So it's actually quite possible that the Excalibur story of King Arthur, of being able to pull the sword out of the stone, actually comes back to Moses pulling the staff out of the ground. That was the immovable staff. So Yitro plays a really important role. So Yitro was one of the advisors to Pharaoh. He was the only one that protested. And Eov stayed silent. He didn't say anything. It seems he kind of played along with it, facilitated the whole thing. And so that now explains why he had to suffer in his future life as Job. Yes, he was righteous, but he had to suffer not only for his sins as Terach, but also for being the bad advisor, one of the bad advisors to Pharaoh. So that's what the Arizal explains. And that's why he had to suffer. So the Arizal says that when the Egyptians tormented the Jews, it was partially because of the advice of Eov and Balaam as well. And that was necessary for him to be rectified. And it's interesting that it says in the suffering of Job, it specifically says that he lost 7 sons and 3 daughters. So what is that an allusion to? The 10 years. Because the Gemara also says that Abraham was in prison 3 years and 7 years. I believe that's an allusion to, again, midah keneged midah, that he lost his own. Just like Terach gave up his own son to be imprisoned and suffering for 7 years and 3 years, Job, in his future life, lost 7 sons and 3 daughters. So the whole connection with children suffering, measure for measure. So that was the reason why Eov had to suffer. Okay. Also, the 3 and 7 alludes to something else. What does 3 and 7 allude to? Does that remind you of something else? Yeah, the Sfirot are divided into 3 and 7, right? You have the 7 midot on the bottom, like we had the 7 weeks of Sfirat HaOmer, and you have the 3 mochin on top. Keter, Chochma, and Bina, or Chochma, Bina, Dat. So there's also, you see many patterns of 3 and 7 in the Torah very often. Include like the 10 plagues, 3 of them were in Parashat Bo, and 7 of them were in Vayera. So when the Torah tells you the story of the 10 plagues, it even splits that into 3 and 7. So you often find patterns of 3 and 7 in the Torah. That's where it comes from. Okay, next question. And we devoted a lot to all these men, but what about women? So a lot of people ask, do women reincarnate? So a lot of people ask me, actually. I heard that the Arizal says women don't reincarnate, that only men reincarnate. So no, that's not the case. Women do reincarnate, and we'll do maybe one or two examples. And the Arizal does say that women reincarnate a lot less than men. They have less need to reincarnate for very simple reasons. First of all, women have less mitzvot than men, a little bit less. Like, women are not expected to say, put on tefillin, or tzitzit, or certain things, or like, the amount of Torah learning that a woman's obligated to fulfill is much less than a man would be. So a man might reincarnate for not doing tefillin, but a woman wouldn't have that. So women generally don't have the time-bound mitzvahs. They have less mitzvahs, not that much less, but slightly less mitzvahs to fulfill. But also just the fact that women are more refined. And the reality is that more than 80% of criminals are men. Most prisons are for men and not for women. The vast majority of violent crimes are men. Women very rarely commit those kinds of things. So women generally just have less sins. That's the reality. So good for you, ladies. So you have less need to reincarnate. So it's not that women don't reincarnate. Sure they do, where necessary. It's just that there's less need to reincarnate because women are naturally less sinful and naturally more refined and have less things to take care of. You can also argue that women suffer more than men in many ways. So they do a lot more kapara avonot. That's the reality. I mean, I didn't make it like that. Right. So things like childbirth and other forms of abuse that women go through that men don't go through. Men have other issues, but women, I think, generally suffer a lot more abuse and generally have a lot more fear. Like, even just operating in the natural world. A man can walk down a street at night and probably not be afraid. A woman probably won't feel safe walking, and that's just the way. So that's also part of Isurin. That's also part of suffering. That's also part of... We discussed this before. We talked about the curses of Eve, that women got a much worse deal in this world. That Adam and Eve were both cursed with 10 curses, and so was the Nachash. We talked about this, I don't know, for those who were there, a class on feminism, that Adam got 10 curses, Eve got 10 curses, but Eve's are much worse. So women tend to suffer more anyways, and they have less sins. So there's far less reason for women to reincarnate. Nonetheless, they do reincarnate, so we want to look at some examples.
When women reincarnate, is it possible for them to reincarnate as men?
Yeah, we also want to, good. That's the other question. Number one, let's see women reincarnating. Number two, can a woman reincarnate as a man or a man as a woman? So we'll get to that also. That's another important question. So we'll start with an example of reincarnation of a woman this time. This I'm quoting for Sefer Gilgulei Neshamot, which again is not from the Kitvei Arizal of Rav Chaim Vital, but from the Rama Mifano, which is it's even more direct. Sefer Gilgulei Neshamot is even in some ways more interesting because it just goes in alphabetical order. And it lists not all, but many people in Tanakh and even in the Talmud and who they were reincarnations of. And so one classic example is Tamar. You remember Tamar, the story of Yehuda and Tamar? Tamar was Yehuda's daughter-in-law, but then two of her husbands died, whatever, and then she ultimately seduced her own father-in-law. She dressed up as a harlot, and she had Yehuda seduced and got pregnant from him. Very bizarre story. Needs a lot of rectification for obvious reasons. So the Rama Mifano, who is again giving us the teachings of the Arizal, is saying, Tamar who did she reincarnate in? Tamar Dvorah. She got reincarnated in Deborah, the judge, the great righteous judge Deborah, who in Judges it says that she sat under a tree. Vehi yoshevet tachat tomer Dvorah, and she's sitting under the famous palm tree of Dvorah, Tomer Dvorah, bein harama uven betel behar Ephraim, ve'yalu alei bnei Yisrael lemishpat. And all the Jewish people, the Israelites in those days, went to her for judgment. She was the chief justice of the land, the Supreme Court. She was the head. And she was sitting, it says, Tachat Tomer Dvorah, very famous. She was sitting under the palm tree of Dvorah. And the Rama Mifano explains that what does it mean, Tachat Tomer Dvorah? It's written, Chaser Ktiv. The Torah is written here where it says Tomer should be Taf, Vav, Mem, Reish. But the way it's spelled in the Torah, in the Tanakh, is Taf, memresh. It's missing a vav. Why is it missing a vav? And the Rama says, because she is Tamar. That's what it's alluding to. This also highlights the importance of being able to study Torah in its original language. Because if you're reading the Torah in English, you will never catch this. Ever. The only way to see this is if you actually see the original Hebrew, and then you would say, why is the word tomer, palm tree, written wrongly here, or defectively? Chaser, it's missing a letter. It's missing the vowel, the vav. It still can be read as tomer, but it can also be read as tamar. So when you're reading it like that in Hebrew, you can read it as, vehi yoshevet tachat Tamar. She is in place of Tamar. She is Tamar. She is the reincarnation of Tamar. That's something you would never catch if you read it in English or in another language. That's why our sages said that when the Torah was first translated into another language, into Greek, it was as tragic as the golden calf. Because you will never capture the Torah's full meaning in another language. So Tamar hi Dvorah, and that's alluded to in the text in Judges, the book of Judges itself. And Shama הייתה יושבת מפני לתקן מה שישבה בפתח עיניים ויחשבה אל הזונה. So her sin, as Tamar was, the Torah says that she sat בפתח עיניים. She sat very modestly on display as this prostitute. That was already a sin. And to rectify that, she sat in her next life very modestly as a holy, modest, righteous judge of Israel. So both involve sitting on display, one as a prostitute, the other as a judge of Israel. That was the rectification. So being available to judge people, to answer people's Torah questions, as opposed to being available for men to do various sins. So that was her rectification. So he focuses on that word, bepetach einayim, that she sat on display. So Dvorah sat on display, but for a good reason, and modestly. She also had to rectify the fact that she was a prostitute, and she seduced her father-in-law. So the Rama Mifan also says, Eshet znunim shalakach Hosea, hi nitzotz Tamar verachav also. So if you remember the story of Hosea the prophet, Hosea, God actually told him, go and marry a prostitute. And he told him, have children with her, and he gave them symbolic names, and mixed together with prophecy. So the prophet Hosea, much later, the Eshet Znunim, her name was actually Gomer. We know her name. She's called Gomer. And she's called in the Tanakh Eshet Znunim, his harlot wife. So she was also Nitzotz Tamar. And again, the wording, how do we know? What's the verse in Genesis? The verse is, it describes Tamar as Vegam Hine. It says that she was, where is it? Gam Hine Hara Liznunim. So it's the same word Znunim. And remember, there's a way of interpreting the Torah where you have the exact same word in two contexts. There's a connection between them. So the wife of Hosea is called Eshet Znunim, and Tamar is called also Znunim. That same word, it's a Gzera Shava, it's the same equivalent terminology. That's alluding to the fact that the Eshet Znunim was a reincarnation of Tamar. And her name was Gomer, Gimel Mem Reish. So again, you see the letters, because Tamar is Taf Mem Reish. And the mar, which literally means the bitter part, the impure part, went into Gomer, Gimel Mem Reish. So Tamar also became Gomer, and she actually did suffer, I guess, as a prostitute at some point, but ultimately was rectified, and then got to marry a prophet, and had a very important prophetic role. The Rama Mifano doesn't say this, but there's also a case to be made. There's another Tamar in Tanakh. Who's the other Tamar in Tanakh? Tamar and Amnon. Remember the kids of King David's two children. They were half brother, half sister. And Amnon was infatuated with Tamar. And ultimately seduced her, raped her. And so that story as well. Like, what did she do to suffer this? The Rama doesn't say this, but it's actually perhaps that Tamar, who was the daughter of King David, was seduced by Amnon in the same way as a measure for measure, because she had seduced in her past life as Tamar her father-in-law Yehuda. Again, it's not explicit in this text. So these are examples of female reincarnations with Tamar. Last thing, and then we'll conclude. And there's another thing that we should be aware of, is not a gilgul, not a reincarnation, but as an ibur. An ibur is literally an impregnation. So this, the Arizal says, is when a soul can attach to you while you're alive. So not a reincarnation from birth, but for a temporary period of time, a soul can join you. A certain spiritual spark can enter you at certain auspicious, specific moments in your life. Like bar bat mitzvah, for instance, when a person's 12 or 13 years old, or 20 years old, because that's the age of adulthood officially. So at certain distinct moments, or when you get married, for example, at certain critical moments of your life, or get divorced, a person can have a soul join them, often to help them to achieve either that soul is a soul of a tzaddik, for example, that joins you and helps you accomplish something, or that's a soul that actually needs rectification and can join you, and then you will rectify that soul. And it'll be part of you for a temporary period of time. It might be a few months, it might be a day, it might be a few years, it might be 12 months. Maybe it can join in your suffering for 12 months, and that could be its Gehenom, for instance. But an ibur is a soul that joins you temporarily. The negative side of an ibur is a dybbuk. A dybbuk is what do you call it?
A demon?
Yeah, what's it called? A possession. A possession, if a person's possessed by another soul, that's a dybbuk. Now, generally we say...
Exorcisms?
Yeah. They're actually in Kabbalistic tradition, there were exorcisms, yes.
Do you think schizophrenic people, they have dybbuk?
I don't think so. I think that's more of like a mental... Dybbuk is like very specific. A schizophrenic person goes in and out of states of where they're manic and not, whatever. Yeah, whereas a dybbuk is more temporary and like the person's possessed, like strangely for a month, a week, until that soul leaves and never comes back again. Schizophrenia is like a person can be very coherent and then goes into a state where they are schizophrenic and become incoherent, So I don't think it's the same.
How common are these dybbuk?
Today, we generally say they don't happen anymore. Sometimes you hear of a story here and there that a person has a dybbuk. I don't know. People do report such things, but they're very, very rare.
Does the person know that?
Probably not. No. They wouldn't even be aware of it. It could sometimes be confused with mental illness, I think, yeah. So there is such a thing. The Arizal doesn't actually talk much about it, but ibur, he does talk a lot about. So there is this idea of a dybbuk, but it's less fleshed out in Jewish texts and far less common than an ibur, which is legitimate and happens all the time. And the Arizal says, listen to this. He says an ibur can also help a woman get pregnant sometimes. And this will also answer the question of, can a man come in a woman's body, a female soul in a male body? So he says, so even though women, like we said, generally don't reincarnate so much, not as much as men do, but they do come in an ibur. So with these new female souls, אם האישה ההיא תתעבר ותער ותלד בת נקבה, אפשר שאותה שבאה בה בסוד העיבור תתגלגל איתה בבחינת גלגול גמור. בביתה הנולדה לה. So what this means is he's saying, look, you have a woman who is having a hard time getting pregnant, perhaps, or maybe she's not having a hard time getting pregnant, but she gets pregnant, and there's an ibur that comes into her, and that when the child will be born, like a girl will be born, she will be the actual reincarnation of that ibur. That's possible as well. So you're pregnant, and you actually have an ibur as part of you, and that child will be born with that actual soul. So that would be a way of one mechanism for a woman to reincarnate. So let's see. It's possible that a male soul can come back in a female body. Beguf nekeva. Lesibat ezu avon. Again, because of some sin that they did. Measure for measure. Like what? What do you think would be a sin for a man to come back as a woman? Right. Kmoshe mishkav zachu. Like somebody who committed sodomy in a past life could actually come back as a woman in their next life. So it's a male soul, committed sodomy, comes back in a female body. והנה הנקבה הזאת שהיא גלגול נשמת זכר, אינה יכולה לקבל הריון ולהתעבר. And such a woman, she's a woman, but she has a male soul. And that actually might cause her not to be able to get pregnant, because only a female soul can get pregnant. So even though she's in a female body, she doesn't have a female soul, so she can't get pregnant. והנה האישה הזאת צריכה זכות גדול לשתוכל להתעבר ולהוליד. So she needs some great merit to be able to get pregnant. ואין לה מציאות אחר, זולתי שתתעבר בה איזו נשמת אישה נקבה אחרת בסוד העיבור. So what happens is an actual female soul will join this woman who has a male soul. So this is a woman. She has a male soul, so she can't get pregnant. But now a female soul will join her in an ibur. Then she'll be able to get those what's called feminine waters. And then she'll be able to get pregnant because of the help of that female ibur. And then that female could actually come back in that child that she gives birth to. And that child will be a girl. And he actually says, אומנם אי אפשר לה ללדת בנים זכרים לשתי סיבות. האחת היא, לפי שהכתוב אומר, אישה כי תזריע וילדה זכר, אבל כאן האישה היא זכר כבעלה. So he's saying this type of woman will never give birth to a boy. She'll only have girls. ואינה יכולה ללדת זכרים אלא נקבות. So two reasons. One, anyway, I'm gonna simplify this. The point is that because she actually needs a female soul to come help her get pregnant, and she gives birth ultimately to that female soul, so she will never have boys. So sometimes you have a situation where, and you might know people like this, a woman that only has girls all the time. She might have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 girls in a row. It could, doesn't mean 100, again, this is speculative. It could be, we don't know, God knows. It could be that that woman actually has a male soul. And so the only way she ever gets pregnant is with an ibur of a female, and she keeps giving birth to these women. And she can never give birth to a boy, no matter how hard they try, they don't get boys, they always get girls. Again, it doesn't mean that every woman you know that only has girls is automatically a male soul. That's not the case. It's sometimes a woman only has girls for what, like Yitro only had girls for whatever reason, right? Sometimes a person needs to have girls for other reasons, whatever it is. But it could be the case. So sometimes you might see a woman who has more masculine tendencies, a more masculine character, and then she has only girls. So that could be a case. And maybe she had trouble getting pregnant. That might be more of, you have to piece together a lot of the evidence. That could be more of a female soul a male soul in a female body. Now, it's important to clarify here that it doesn't mean that a female soul a male soul in a female body is gonna be, let's say, a homosexual or something. It doesn't automatically mean that. It doesn't mean that she's gonna be transgender or a transvestite or no. She could actually be a perfectly normal woman, just happens to have a male soul. It might express itself in certain more masculine qualities, or qualities that we might perceive as being more masculine. But otherwise, she could be a very feminine lady. So I just want to clarify that. It doesn't mean, these are not the same. A male soul in a female body is not automatically a lesbian woman. That's not how it works. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. Now, what it could explain, though, why there are people who have these gender issues. It could explain why people have issues with sexual orientation or gender or whatever. They feel like they're in the wrong body. When transgender people say, I feel like I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or vice versa, a woman trapped in a man's body, that could be this. It could be. I'm not saying it is, but it might be this issue. Of course, the doing a gender reassignment surgery in that case wouldn't actually solve the problem. Because the whole point is that's the tikkun. That's the suffering that you have to experience. So doing the gender reassignment wouldn't help. And often, statistically, it doesn't. If you look at the actual data, a lot of people who get gender reassignment surgery are actually not better off and often want to go back to what they were before. They think that when they switch genders, all their problems will go away. But oftentimes you find, and there's a lot of statistics on this now, it didn't solve their problem. Right, mentally, emotionally, they're not any healthier than they were before. Some are, but many also report that they're not, and it didn't help. And sometimes they even want to go back, and it could be too late at that point. So,
determination of the gender of the fetus occurs at 15 weeks after fertilization. At that time, if there are testes and it's a genetic male, then testosterone will be produced and will peak. At 15 weeks after fertilization. If in the brain there is a shortage of testosterone receptors, then in that case the person will be a male body but a female brain.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors. I have genetics background, so it could also be Klinefelter syndrome, one of these where you have a man that has an extra X chromosome and has more feminine tendencies. So that's possible too. Klinefelter syndrome is it's like 1 in 1,000 men have it. They don't even know it. Oftentimes they don't even know it. Sometimes you see a man with more feminine features. It could be that he actually has Klinefelter syndrome where he has an extra X chromosome. So it's very complicated. There are so many reasons, both genetic, psychological, neurological. There's so many reasons for why it could be. I don't want to get into that now, but spiritually, it is possible that a male soul is in a female body or a female soul is in a male body. Okay, so that's ibur, that's male and female reincarnation, male and female souls. That might help to explain gender issues, orientation issues, fertility issues even, why certain women have only certain genders as children. That's another potential explanation. Okay, let's finish. We're out of time. One last point that I spoke about this before once several years ago in the Fundamentals of Kabbalah class, and I think it's a good way to conclude, to bring that idea back, because I think it has even more significance now, a few years later. Going back to all of this, to Adam, we find that everything kind of goes back to Adam, Cain and Abel. And the Arizal does say that all human souls were ultimately contained within Adam and Eve, the first people, in some way. He actually outlines 5 general types of souls. There are souls called new souls, neshamot chadashot. There are neshamot yeshanot, that are old souls. The old souls tend to be the ones that were part of Adam and Eve when they consumed the fruit, and they fell very deep into the klipa. They're very spiritually unrefined. Old souls have to do the most work, and the Arizal says they're going to reincarnate many, many times. There are also new souls that were part of Adam and Eve, but weren't part of them. They left them before they consumed the fruit. So they're actually more pure, and they need less reincarnations, and so on. There's various types of souls. Okay, there are souls that were possibly even not part of Adam, or were only part of Adam as an ibur that came later. But ultimately, all the souls are somehow related to Adam and Eve. He also says there are souls of Cain and souls of Abel. So there are actual people who are stereotypical, kind of archetypal souls of Cain, archetypal souls of Abel. And there are also souls of converts, which he says are unique souls, but also have some connection ultimately to Adam. Now, why is this all important? We all come back to Adam. Adam contained all of mankind within him. Now, why is this interesting? Because the Arizal says that Adam had all these souls, all these sparks. How many did he have? How many souls and sparks are there? Because that will tell you how many people are destined to ever live. How many possible sparks and souls does Adam really break up into?
600,000.
So he says like this. He says, look, we have 5 levels to the soul, right? Nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, that's what he said. And there are 5 partzufim, which they correspond to. A little more complicated. We're not going to talk about that. And there are different worlds. Remember, there's the 4 worlds. Yasiyah, Yetzirah, Bria, Atzilut, and even a higher world called Adam Kadmon, the primordial man. So he says like this. Each of the 5 souls is actually split into a further 5. And each of those is split into 613. Why? Because a person has 613 body parts, 248 bones and organs, and 365 like nerves and sinews. That's why we have 248 positive commandments, 365 negative commandments. So the Arizal says, just like your body, your physical body has 613 parts, your soul has 613 parts. But it's each soul, like each of the 5 souls, and each of those is broken up corresponding to the various worlds. So the Arizal will often speak of, nefesh de atzilut, or this, like the nefesh that belongs to the world of atzilut, for instance. Or there could be like a neshama of bria, for instance. So different pieces, and each of those pieces has 613 parts. And then finally he says, how many possible sparks can you get? He says the maximum is samech ribua, which means 600,000. 6 times 10,000. 600,000, just like there were 600,000 people, or at least men, at 600,000 root souls at Mount Sinai. So each of those souls can split into 600,000. Now, if you do the calculation, there's a few ways to do it. There's souls, there's olamot, there's 613 and 600,000. You basically have two possible calculations. If you go with 4 worlds, which is typically we say there's 4 worlds, Asiya, Yetzira, Bria, Atzilut, you get 7.3 billion sparks. If you go with 5 worlds, because there is a higher world, a more hidden world of Adam Kadmon, then you're going to get about 9.5 billion. So your range is 7.3 to 9.5 billion possible human sparks, distinct human sparks. And I find that number significant because that's roughly where the world's population is today. Right now, currently, it's estimated that the world's population is 8.1 billion. And it's interesting that demographers predict that Earth's population will actually peak at 9.5 billion by around 2050. And then they're predicting it'll actually start to decline. It's already declining rapidly in the Western world. Birth rates are plunging and so on. But once the rest of the world catches up, and like the third world catches up, and birth rates are kind of starting to fall everywhere. And the prediction is that by 2050, the curve will shift and Earth's population will stop increasing and it'll actually start to decrease. So there's this idea that Earth's population will peak at about 9.5 billion. And it's interesting that right now we're at like 8 billion. Now, why is this interesting? Because the Talmud actually says, Ein bein David ba, Mashiach won't come, ad sheichlu kol neshamot shebaguf. That Mashiach won't come until all the souls that are destined to be born will be born. And it uses a strange term. It says neshamot shebaguf, all the souls in the body, literally. What does that mean, all the souls in the body? So the Gemara says, Mashiach won't come until all the souls in the body are born. What body? What does that mean, all the neshamot shebaguf? Right, so the Arizal says in Shara Psukim, Ki kol neshamot shebaguf. So the Arizal explains that kol neshamot shebaguf is really talking about the sparks that were in the first guf, in Adam. And they, he says, need to be yituknu terem baha geula. They have to be rectified before Mashiach comes. So all aspects of mankind, all the souls that ever lived, all the souls that were in Adam, the first man, all of these sparks have to be rectified. All parts of Adam have to come back and be rectified. Even a tiny spark, even the tiniest spark of Adam has to come back. Afilu Balaam, even the wicked ones, every single one. Lefi shaya bo ktsat nitzotz kedusha, nitgalgel ben aval, as we know. And that's how he started his rectification. Umisham ve'elech nishlemu kol hanitzotzot shayu klolim bo. ועל דרך זה יהיה בכל שורשי הנשמות, כולם יתוקנו קודם הגאולה. ואז יתגאלו. So for all of mankind to experience the geula, everybody has to be rectified. Everybody has to rectify Adam. So everybody will come back at the end of days, so that before Mashiach comes, so that everybody could experience the geula. So that's fascinating, because if Adam really did have, whatever it is, 9.5 billion sparks, then we are fast approaching that number where all the souls that have ever lived will be alive simultaneously. Meaning right now we're getting to a point where everybody that ever lived, all the souls that ever lived, all those sparks, all those fragmented sparks will be alive simultaneously. And that makes sense, because then you could have Judgment Day. Because God does say that there will be a Judgment Day here on earth, and I will judge everybody. So it all comes together with what we've been saying, what we said with Antoninus and Rabbi Yehuda, that Judgment Day is here on earth, that Gan Eden and Gehenom and Olam Haba is here, you get your reward here. So God is saying, just like Rabbi Yehuda said, God will bring back all the souls into a body and judge them here, and then they'll get their reward or suffering what they deserve. So it all comes back together. And the Arizal says, before the Geula, all the souls that ever lived will come back and will live simultaneously on the planet, and they will be judged, and they will be rectified. Ve'az yitga'alu. So we can all experience that Geula together. All aspects of mankind, every human that ever lived, every soul. Nobody's going to miss it, right? It's the greatest event in history. Nobody's going to miss it. Every soul that ever lived will be here. Every soul that ever lived will be rectified in whatever way they need to in this final series of a sequence of events that's to come. And finally, every nitzotz, which has a source in holiness, every spark will experience the Geula, and then we'll all have that perfect world, the Olam Haba, that we await. So hopefully we see that day soon. We'll end with that.